Hi everyone and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about a test that is even better than HOMA-IR for determining insulin resistance, but it's not always practical. So I'm not saying that HOMA-IR is not useful, but for some people it's not enough. So a few weeks ago I was talking about HOMA-IR, if you remember that, and I first had a video on what it is, and then a couple of weeks ago I revealed my HOMA-IR, what my lab tests were saying, and it's a really good test to identify insulin resistance when blood sugar isn't enough. So some people might have a normal blood sugar even after eating, but they don't have a normal insulin response, and that insulin might be elevated over time even when you're fasting, and that's how we can find out with HOMA-IR. And it's probably the absolute best and most convenient test that you can do if you want to find out if you're insulin resistant. But for some people it's not enough. And I'm going to show you why the Kraft test is necessary for some people to actually identify the insulin resistance that is going on. So anyone can test blood sugar at home. That's really easy to do. To do HOMA-IR, you need to go to a lab and have your fasting insulin levels tested, and that is obviously a little bit more work. But the Kraft test is a lot more work. So that's probably one of the reasons why you haven't heard about it. At least I hadn't heard about it until not that long ago, actually. And I know I promised to make a video on it, and I have actually dragged it a little bit, so here it goes. And it's about time, because this weekend we're going to have Nick back on live to answer all questions about insulin resistance, HOMA-IR, inflammatory hysteresis, and possibly even exercise if you want to ask him about that. So I think that the Kraft test is probably the absolute best test that is out there, but it's not necessary for everyone to do. But it's not easy to do, and it takes a lot of time to do, and it's probably quite hard to find the practitioner that is doing it. So it requires a little bit of research. But I'm hoping that by spreading the knowledge and hopefully the demand for this test, that we will be able to, or I will be able to contribute to this test being used more often, and hopefully the people that need a test done will get the help that they need. So when I talked about my HOMA-IR a few weeks ago, I told you that it's roughly about 0.5, which is pretty much ideal. So I have a really good HOMA-IR score, and it looks like I'm highly insulin sensitive on the basis of my HOMA-IR and my fasting insulin, my fasting blood glucose, etc. So that's all good. But this might not be the case for you, or it might look good on paper, but you don't feel well. You feel like you have some signs and symptoms of hyperinsulinemia. So you may have normal fasting insulin value, but your insulin is not reacting normally when you are eating food. It might go just way over the top, but it will go down quickly, or fairly quickly, to baseline and look normal when you're fasting. So this is what the Kraft test is measuring. So this test is just an extension on the oral glucose tolerance test. So if you don't know what this test is, basically what you do, this is a normal test that your GP can do when you are testing for diabetes type 2. That's how they usually assess whether you are type 2 diabetic or not. So they basically give you a drink of 75 grams of a sugary liquid or glucose in the fluid, and it's pure glucose. And 75 grams in there, you drink it, and then they're measuring your blood glucose, usually after 1 hour and 2 hours. Sometimes they include 30 and 90 minutes as well, depending on what practitioner you have and how they're doing it. So what they're looking at is if your blood glucose is more than or less than 140 milligrams per deciliter or 7.8 millimoles per liter, after 2 hours, you're not diabetic. That's the only thing that they use. And then if it's between 140 and 199, or between 7.8 and 11, you're pre-diabetic. And if it's above that, you have type 2 diabetes. That's the assessment that they make when you go in for a glucose tolerance test. When you're doing the Kraft test, what you're doing is that together with the testing of your blood glucose, you're also testing your insulin. And they do this every 30 minutes. No, sorry, they do it after 30 minutes and then every hour. But they don't stop at 2 hours. They go on for 5 hours. So this is why it's so inconvenient. First of all, you need to find a practitioner that is willing to do it. You might be able to talk your GP into it. They might not even know about the test. Hopefully they do, but not everyone does. And then you need to sit there and have your insulin drawn every hour. So you have it 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2, 3, 4, and 5 hours. That's 6 blood tests that you're doing in a day, just to measure your Kraft score. So you can see why it's not practical to do. It takes a lot of time, and time is money. They don't like doing it. But the reason that this test is so useful is that many people have a normal fasting blood glucose level, like me, and some even have a normal fasting insulin level, like me. But it might be skyrocketing when you're eating. So your pancreas might be working really, really hard to shove all that glucose into your liver and not into your cells in order to keep it down and keep you from having this hyperglycemia when you're eating. So your pancreas is working overtime, and it's just a matter of time when it's not going to be able to do this anymore because you're overworking it and it's working really, really hard. And you want to be able to identify that as early as possible in patients so that you can reverse it. Because the further you go, the harder it's going to be to reverse the condition. That's probably the same for all conditions that we have. So if you have, like me, you have a normal blood glucose, you have a normal insulin level, fasting insulin level that is, but you don't feel quite right. You feel like you have some symptoms, and it might be that you're having just things like all your fat deposits are around your belly, like abdominal obesity, or maybe you've got hypertension, high blood pressure, maybe PCOS or skin tags, those kind of things, or elevated triglycerides in combination with low HDL, for example, or your height to waist ratio is way out of whack, which is obviously is depending on your central obesity as well. So all those kind of things that might not, if you just have one of them, you might not really think about them, but they're all signs and symptoms of you having some sort of insulin or blood glucose issues. And you go and do a lab test, everything looks fine, and you think, oh, it's cool, I'll just keep eating what I'm doing, and you just keep working on it, and your pancreas is not happy. So what Mr. Joseph Kraft did was that he identified 5 distinct patterns of elevated insulin. And since then, I have heard about a 6th pattern being kind of looked at, but I don't have the info, and I can't remember. I can remember who said it, but I can't remember where I heard it. So I need to look into that further, and I haven't really had time to do that. But let me just show this picture, which I have not made myself. Here we go. So this is a very nice picture. I stole it from the address that you can see there if you want to go and check that out. And I think it's Dr. Ted Naiman who has done that from the beginning for them. So we're going around here. So essentially what this is, if you look at pattern 1, the little green one there, that is a pattern of metabolically healthy people. the insulin rises fairly quickly and it doesn't go sky high, and then it goes down again fairly quickly. Both insulin and glucose are normal, and the peak insulin level is reached just after 30 minutes, and that's why we want to take the first test at 30 minutes. And after 3 hours, the baseline, you're back to baseline, so no rise in insulin, no rise in blood glucose, etc. So that is a good pattern that we want to have. If you then have a look at number 2, the yellow one, this is a delayed insulin peak. So the insulin levels rise quickly, but goes a lot higher than necessary. So the fasting insulin still looks normal, and the peak level is reached after 30 to 60 minutes. So this is what you will see when you measure at 30 minutes and at 60 minutes. It keeps going up. And it also takes a little bit longer for it to come down, because this is why we're talking about a delayed insulin peak. And generally it takes between 4 to 5 hours. The glucose response will look totally normal, but you will have elevated insulin. So a person with this pattern has a form of hyperinsulinemia. Okay, and then we have pattern 3, which is the orange one. So this is it's kind of similar to pattern 2, but it's even more delayed. So the insulin peak comes much later, and it doesn't actually reach its peak until after 2 to 3 hours. So this is just taking much longer to get back to baseline. And it might look, if you look at the graph here, we can't see exactly where it starts, but it might not look too bad if you're measuring your insulin after 30 minutes or even an hour. So if any of you were on my live stream a couple of days ago, and I was comparing low carb with low fat diets for weight loss, they were talking about one of the measurements that they did in that study was that they were measuring insulin after 30 minutes when they subjected the participants to an oral glucose tolerance test. So for this person here who is in category 3 or have pattern 3, their insulin might look normal after just 30 minutes, but it might not be normal. So they're missing out on so much data by doing this. So anyway, it takes about 2 to 3 hours to get reach the peak, which means that you're not going to be back to baseline after 5 hours when this test ends. The glucose response may still be normal, but it can be at diabetic levels as well. If the insulin is, we say 2 to 3 hours where it's peaking, the earlier it peaks, the more likely you are to have normal glucose levels when you look at it. Some people like to divide this into 3A and 3B, depending on if it's 2 and 3 hours. But we're just calling it 3 here to make it a little bit easier. So this is obviously also a pattern of hyperinsulinemia, which is pre-diabetes basically. We haven't quite got to that stage yet, but we are heading there. And you might also see strange lipid levels with this profile. And then we have pattern 4, that's the big red one. So this is definitely insulin resistance, there is no doubt about it. Your fasting insulin levels are usually elevated when you have this profile, as you can see here. It goes down, it doesn't go quite down to the same baseline as the others, it sits a little bit elevated, but it might not be high enough for a GP to react to, and it might still not be too bad if you're just looking at one test of insulin. Okay. In response to a oral glucose tolerance test, your insulin will just go through the roof, as you can see. There is lots of it, and it goes up very quickly. As you can see, after 30 minutes it's already up to 150. It peaks later, so your pancreas keeps pumping out lots and lots of insulin, but the peak is still not until after 2-3 hours, and then it's going down very, very slowly. And after 5 hours, it's still not back to. It could be back to baseline, but it might not be. And baseline is usually elevated. So this is definitely insulin resistance, and there's no doubt about it. If you're measuring this, most practitioners would probably be able to pick up on it if they were measuring it. But early stages, you might still be low enough to not be picked up quite. And then we had stage 5 or pattern 5. You can see the little blue one down there. That looks quite nice, doesn't it? But that's kind of deceptive. So what we would say in scientific terms or in medical terms, you are insulinopenic, which means that you do not have your insulin is the response is broken. You have too little insulin, basically. The insulin is low, and that sounds good, but it's not that great actually, because your fasting insulin is very low. And the problem here is that we are measuring, if this was the case and it was just low, it might be good. But when you're measuring as a response to an oral glucose tolerance test, it's not great. Because you want the insulin so that you can store the glucose. If you're drinking 75 grams of glucose, you don't want that to remain in your blood. You want it to be stored. And with these levels of insulin, you can see it goes up tiny bit. And then it stays there for 2-3 hours, and then it goes down to baseline, which is not far off to the level it's gone up. So what they're measuring here is that if all the values are less than 30 microunits per milliliter, you are a pattern 5 person. And that is the typical pattern of a type 1 diabetic. So when your body is no longer able to produce any insulin in response to glucose, that is when you are type 1 diabetic. There are other types of diabetes that it could be as well, but most likely it's type 1 diabetes. So the insulin sufficiency is most likely due to damaged or exhausted islet cells in the pancreas. And your glucose tolerance, when you're measuring the blood glucose at the same time as you're measuring your insulin here, it will be through the roof because you don't have the insulin to actually store it. And this might be a case for when you actually want to be treated with exogenous insulin, as in insulin shots. Okay. Gonna stop sharing that. So those are the 5 different ones, and as you can see, they're all but the 5th one are about a delayed insulin response. And the delay might be that your cells are just, they're not functioning optimally anymore. They're starting to get lazy and damaged, and it takes a while for them to actually respond. But then they will do their absolute best to get rid of that blood glucose. And you're not going to pick that up necessarily with a fasting insulin blood test. Because as you saw, especially in pattern 1 and 2, the fasting, and 3 to some degree, the fasting insulin levels are going to be normal. So you wouldn't know how you react to food necessarily. And the thing is that when it's delayed, the insulin response to 2 to 3 hours, it is delayed because you need to produce so much of it to get your blood glucose levels down. So you might start seeing some elevation or prolonged periods of time with elevated blood glucose when you're eating with this pattern, if you are checking it over several hours. But most people don't check it after 2 hours. So you could do some experimentation there, checking your blood glucose several hours after you have been eating. I'll see what actually happens. I might do that as another interesting video. I might, next time I'm having a cheat meal or whatever we want to call it, and eating out, preferably I would want to include sugar there, because it just makes it even worse. So I might do that at some point. So just a couple of things that I want to mention as well. If you are doing a test like either the oral glucose tolerance test or the Kraft test, if you're on a low carb diet, or if you are on a carnivore diet, and if you have, especially if you've been doing it strictly and for a very long period of time, it might be a good idea for you to reintroduce carbohydrates into your diet a week before doing this test. That is just because your body is no longer used to producing insulin and secreting it, because you're not eating a lot of carbohydrates. And you want to have all the enzymes and the production of the insulin and all that up to your normal capacity when you're doing the test, because otherwise you might go in and do it and it might look like you are extremely insulin resistant, because your body won't respond. Your body's not used to you downing 75 grams of carbs. So generally it's recommended that you consume 100 to 150 grams of carbs per day for a week before doing this test, so that your body is used to actually metabolizing this many carbs. Otherwise you might get a false result. So if you want to do it and you're on a low carb diet, consider whether it's worth doing, if you know it is a test worth doing at all, and are you willing to actually reintroduce this amount of carbs. I'm not sure you need to eat 100 to 150 grams of carbs every day for a week, but what I would probably do is I would ramp up a little bit. I would start introducing it on day 1, increase day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so that the last couple of days, at least before the test, I'm definitely on that kind of level, because you're going to drink 75 grams of pure glucose, and that is going to have an impact on your blood glucose. So you want everything to work optimally. You don't want to give to take the test and then get a false positive result. Yeah, so if you don't do that, you just go straight in and think, I'm going to try it anyway, you will probably get extreme hyperinsulinemia and increased or hyper blood glucose. My brain is just freezing. If you go straight in there and you just do it without testing, you will get hyperinsulinemia, and hyperglycemia is the right word. There we go. I had to start that sentence over. And your doctor is going to tell you that you've got type 2 diabetes, and then you're going to blame your keto diet or your carnivore diet for giving you type 2 diabetes. And that is not the case, because you can reverse that. You can get the whole system and your insulin secretion up to speed very, very quickly by introducing some carbs again. So that is the Kraft test, and hopefully most of you don't feel like you need to do it. But I thought, it's a good thing to talk about, and it's a test that I wish was more available to people that don't feel good, literally. And there are many, many people out there that is walking around with the central obesity and all the abdominal fat that they have, and they have normal glucose levels. And I don't think that they are healthy, because that sort of fat accumulation is not ideal. I have a tendency to do that myself. When I put on weight, it goes to my stomach. When I was younger, it went to my legs. Figure why. With age, we just damage our bodies more and more, and that is what's going to happen. So watch out for all those signs and symptoms, even if you are having good blood values, even HOMA-IR, which I think is brilliant, but it doesn't cover everything. And I think that the Kraft tests actually do. Just probably expensive and very labor and time intensive. So don't do it if you don't need to do it, but if you really, really want to find out what's going on and you don't feel good and you think that you're insulin resistant, but everyone is telling you that you're not, maybe go and ask for a Kraft test instead. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, just do that. Press the subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and be happy, be merry. Leave me a comment, let me know what you think, let me know if there's any other topic that you want me to cover. I'm happy to look into a lot of interesting biomarkers, biochemistry, anything physiology wise I'm really interested in, and I wouldn't mind sharing that, but I don't know everything on top of my head right now, so I need to do a little bit of research before answering a lot of questions that I get from you guys. So thank you so much for being part of this community and for supporting me on YouTube. I really appreciate that. You take care, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.